Today we're recreating Technoblades house from the Dream SMP. Now, I've actually done this before a couple years ago, but in hindsight, I'm not the biggest fan of the design for the house. It was made bigger for the sake of having more storage and things, but in doing so, it just doesn't have the same vibe anymore. So we're going to redo it. Now, to avoid too many failed attempts, I did some wall design tests before getting started, and I've decided to keep the main design for the walls, except to keep things interesting, I've added some texturing to the white concrete. Using some concrete powder and wool, it makes the walls look a bit more worn and less pristine, which I feel is a lot more fitting for a small cabin in the snow. Now, the width of the build has also been increased in order to have a bit more room when detailing the inside, as much like the first time I recreated it, there's a huge problem when it came to the size, so instead of making 2 floors, I've just made it slightly wider and longer, but keeping the overall shape. Now for the chimney, I've actually used bricks instead of stone, because it makes it feel a lot more interesting than having the same 2 colours throughout the whole build. And moving on to the horse stable, I don't think the design changed very much from the original. To be honest, I'm not the best at building barns or farm areas, so I had a lot more bother on this bit than I probably should have, but we did get there eventually. And just for some final detailings on the outside, and we can finally move on to the interior. Now, the interior of the house was probably the hardest part of the whole build. I'm not exactly known for building small details, and unfortunately, the interior is exactly that. But I've managed to make it work by adding a small kitchen on the end with a rug in the middle of the room, which we can actually have now because we increased the size of the house. Also adding some shelves in the walls, an armor stand, and adding some stairs, which brings us to the basement. Now, aside from the classic chests in the wall like from the original build, I've added some barrels and things scattered around the room, which was mainly for the aesthetic, but also because barrels are a nightmare to organise because they only have one single chest storage, so I thought it was quite fitting. And we've got all the machine stuff scattered about, which was originally upstairs, but I feel like it makes much more sense and looks nicer not being in the middle of the house. And moving on to the attic, it was pretty straightforward. Aside from forgetting the window and having to rebuild that later, I just had to add some chests, make the iconic membership bell, of course, and add the bed at the end of the room with a small bedside cabinet. Which brings us to the final build. You have no idea how happy I am if I actually managed to recreate the house properly. Like, the original was alright. This one does just look like the original, but a bit different, you know? It has the same sort of detailing, it has the same shit, oh my god. Now, I have noticed I put the door on the long side of the wall and not this side like the original. I'm gonna hope you can gloss over that for me, please. But you know, it is facing the right way, you know, the door is originally facing this way, going over to Phil's house, which obviously I haven't built, but you know, if you want to see Phil's house being built, you could tell me in the comments. Now, much like my first design, I did end up adding some leaves because it does just make it look a lot more lively than just having a random house in the middle of nowhere, as well as adding all the snow layers puffed up at the sides and stuff, because yeah, it just looks a little more worn and set into the environment. I'm not entirely happy with the shape of this, but because the original was at a diagonal in the house, I did not want to have to build that, so yeah. And obviously the basement has been made bigger, but I do feel like this looks quite nice compared to the original, which was just a stone box under the ground. And of course, we've got the upstairs, which is slightly bigger than I thought it was going to be, but I'm not exactly complaining. So, you know, if you like the build and you like the video, well, as Techno once put it, subscribe!